Hey y'all, today on Coder Couple I'm going to be showing you how to use the useState hook in the new React hooks introduced with React 16.8 and show you how to convert your existing class component functionality into the functional component version which uses the useState hook. So I've created a Create React App project. You see in the project browser, we've got app.js, and we're going to be rendering two components, the class counter, that's going to be the old functionality, and the hooks counter, that's going to be the functional component with the useState. So let's start with class counter. We're just going to be making a quick little counter to show the functionality differences. We're going to be importing React from React, export default class counter extends component. Didn't want to grab that for me. And let's make a constructor. And we'll set this .state equal to an object. We'll have a render method. Let's start off by returning a div, put a P in there, fill that in later. Put a button in there too. And the button will say increment so that we can increment the counter. Let's see, so now we need to set something in state. We're going to be using the state variable count to keep track of our counter. We'll set it to 0 to start. Now that we have that, we can put the count and display it inside of the P element, this.state.count. And we'll need a onClick listener for this button so that it will run setState when clicked. And we will pass an object to setState. The object will have the count property with this.state.count plus 1 so that it will take the current count and increment it by 1. Okay, and then all I'm going to do here is add console logs so that we get a little message that we can visually see when it's rendering, and we will log the current value of state so that we can see what is going on. Okay, now that I've got that, all I need to do is render it inside of app. Cool, that should be all we need. Now let's run npm start to run our Create React app. Cool, so now you can see it's rendering this class counter here. Let's get our console up. You can see it's rendered one time. State is equal to an object with a key of count and a value of 0. And when I press this increment button, it does what we want it to do. It increments the count, and we get a console log showing that that is updating. Cool, so now let's do the exact same thing, but using a functional component with the useState hook. So import React, and I'll go ahead and also add the useState named component from React. Cool. Now I like to do this. I like to set my functional components to a const. Other ways to express that, that's my preferred way. And we'll want to export our functional component like that. We don't need any props for this component. Otherwise, we could put them here and destructure them. And this is not a class, of course, so we won't have any methods. All we'll have is some HTML that we're returning, or really a React element that we're returning. We'll return the exact same thing as we did in our class component, a div with a P and a button. Okay, and we'll need to put something there. Now, how do we keep track of our state? We use the useState hook. Okay, and one of the rules of hooks is that your hooks have to come in the highest level of your functional component. You can't do something like this. Okay, or this. You have to always use your hooks outside of conditional statements like this. I'll show you later how to actually use the conditionals inside of your effects. That'll be in our use effect video. Right, so the useState hook. Now we only need to pass it one argument. That's going to be our initial state value or init state. So for our counter, see, I'll go ahead and pull this up on the side. So just like in our class-based counter, we're going to set the initial count to 0. Okay, so that's all we need to get that state going. And now this will work fine, but we can't really do anything with it yet. useState will actually return an array. So the array will look like this. It'll be an array with two values. Okay, the first value will be the actual state value. Okay, so we can call that anything we want. We'll say it's value generically. And the second value it will pass will be a set state function for that value. So more properly, it would be like set value. Okay, and now you can actually use a single variable to do this. Okay, that's fine. Now something would be an array, but what we actually want to do is destructure it right here. If you're familiar with that syntax, it's taking the result of this expression and it will destructure it into two separate variables. Okay, so the first variable again is the state value, and we will call that count in this case. You can call it anything you want, and most appropriately here it's a count. And then the second value that gets returned in this array again is going to be our callback function to actually set the state. It's not going to set all of the states that we define, just this one state for count. So it's very important to call it set something, where something is equal to whatever you're calling this variable. That way your code is very easy to read and easy to understand. So we'll say set count. Okay, so we got count and set count. Now how do we use this? It's just like before. Instead of saying this.state.count, we just use count. Very simple. And then how do we do our onClick listener? Well, instead of saying this.setState, we will just say set count. Okay, and that replaces this.setState with count in it. And what do we set it to? We set it to count plus 1. Okay, now this is a lot more expressive and accomplishes the same thing. And I will add the same console log here. We'll say it's rendering. And we don't have this.state. We will just, we can actually mirror the format by logging an object like that. And I'll actually just use the object syntax where the value actually just gets passed with its variable name as the key. Okay, so that should be good. Now what we'll want to do is go back to app.js, and we'll want to replace this with our hooks counter. Great, now I'm going to save, and that recompiles. And we have hot reloading over here, so this is actually just reset our component and updated it. I can do a hard refresh so that you can see that is in fact what's happened. And it renders one time with count equal to 0, just like before. And when we press increment, it will increment it as expected. Okay, so this functionality in hooks counter here is now exactly, give you a little more room to see here. This is exactly the same functionality as what's going on over here. Now it may seem like a small difference, but this is actually a huge improvement in readability. It allows you to couple functionalities together in an effect, which we'll talk about later, instead of having them separated in different lifecycle methods. So this is actually a hugely superior syntax that allows for much more maintainable React code than this. A couple of key things to keep in mind though, particularly if you're coming from a class background where you've used classes a lot in the past, you may expect some things to work that actually work a little bit differently. So I'm just going to grow on this example a little bit, do something a little bit unrelated. We'll do const groceries and set groceries, for example. Okay, and now instead of passing an integer as the state, I'm going to pass an object. Okay, and you may be tempted to use objects as your initial state because you're used to using objects here in the class-based components. Now, I will actually advise against this in most cases. Sometimes you will need objects, but if possible, it's better to separate things out so that you have primitive data types that you're working with in most cases. But let's just say we're making a groceries list, and let's say we just apples 2 and oranges 1. Okay, and now let's just delete our counter for a second. We'll make a button that says update groceries. Okay, and we'll do another on click. Okay, and then this one will set groceries. And now you may be thinking, okay, if I do set groceries apples 3, you may be expecting this to update apples to 3 and leave oranges as 1, because that's exactly what it did when you created this functionality in a class, is that it only updated the actual key value pair that you specified. Okay, but let's actually see what happens when we change it to this. We will log groceries to the console. That should be fine, and I will hit save to update it. Okay, now we've removed our p tag, so all we see is the update groceries button. I'll expand this a bit so you can see that on the first render, groceries has an object where apples is 2 and oranges is 1. Okay, and now when I press update groceries, we'll see what happens. Okay, so now it's set apples to 3 and it's gotten rid of oranges. So unlike in the class-based version of this, where you update apples and it retains the other classes, the class variables, the hooks-based version of this actually just completely overwrites the previous class variable with a completely new object and doesn't retain any of these key value pairs in your objects. So that's a point of confusion for people who are new to hooks. Let's see, what else do we want to discuss? One more thing with the useState hooks. So let's say that you're mounting a component for the very first time and you have some kind of expensive operation that needs to occur to determine the initial state. Let's say that we have this function called expensive function. Okay, say console.log running the expensive function, and it's not actually that expensive, we'll just return 1. Okay, so and then we want to set our initial state to the value that's returned from this function, and in this real life version, obviously your expensive function will do something greater than this, but let's just use this as an example for now. So we could call expensive function and use its return value as our initial state. Okay. Now we will be able to what was I saying? Okay, so we will be able to see how many times this expensive function is run. Okay, let's get rid of this so we can have a clear picture of what's going on. And let's just say, this groceries doesn't make much sense anymore, but let's just stick with it. Let's say we're going to set groceries to groceries plus 1. Okay. In fact, I'll probably just go back to saying count because this makes a little more sense. We'll say increment. Okay, so this is like the original example where we have count and set count. Okay, and it's going to start at 1 in this case, but let's pretend we have like a really expensive function that could be calling some API, or it could be doing a really expensive calculation with a whole lot of data going through its payload. So let's just see how this goes. Okay, so I'll hit save and it'll reload. Let's just clear our console. So you can see it rendered one time running the expensive function. Okay, let's hit increment and it ran the expensive function again. And you can see this counter right here, 3, 4, 5. You can see it's running the expensive function every single time that this function is re-rendered, even though we really don't need the initial value anymore. We only needed the initial value on the initial render. We don't actually want to keep running this expensive function over and over again. So there's a very easy way of solving this. You aren't restricted to just passing a value into useState. You can also pass a callback function that will resolve only on the first render. Okay, this will help to save a lot of inefficient processing or API requests because useState will receive this function as its initial value, and then it will only run it one time when the component first mounts. So let's try this again. We'll do a hard refresh after our save, and now I'll hit increment, and it's not running the expensive function except for that very first time. Let's put a P tag there so we can keep track of our count. Do a hard refresh. So we're incrementing the count, but it only ran that expensive function one time. So setting this callback is a very useful way of optimizing your app if you have some complex mechanism of setting this initial state value here. All right, that was the useState hook. Next time we're gonna be learning about the useEffect hook, so be sure to subscribe to our channel so you can get updates about React. If you enjoyed this video, learned anything, be sure to hit the like button. That goes a long way in helping us know what content is most helpful for you. And leave us a comment if you have any questions or any ideas for videos, topics you want discussed. See you next time.